Well, I want to do a little bit of a test with the audience. That's why I've got Derek back here. As a former worship leader, I used to have a lot of fun seeing which parts of the song you, the audience, think you're supposed to clap to. All right, it's actually quite funny to see the rhythm that church people bring into the auditorium with them. So what I'm gonna do, I wanna have Derek just give us a little drum solo, and I wanna see where you think you are supposed to clap. All right, so Derek, just to take it away for a second. Okay, hold on. First of all, I'm feeling like Wayne's World for a second, like we are not worthy. All right, so that's kind of hard to discern the beat. So what I'm gonna ask him to do is go to just a simple kick snare hat, because drum solos are just kind of like melting your face off, rock and roll, but worship music is a little bit more in the pocket. So give us just, by the way, can we give it up? That was pretty sick, right? So just give us a simple kick snare hat, and I want to see where you think you're supposed to clap. Ready? Go. Okay, I see some hands going. Yeah, pretty good. You got it. I like that. Pause for a second. So how come you have such a hard time doing that during the songs? So that is called clapping on the 2 and 4. There is a certain rhythm to music, and it's divided up in categories of every 4 beats, the measure starts over. So you're supposed to clap on 2 and 4. I want you to clap on 1 and 3 and see how weird that feels. This is what some of y'all do, by the way. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 3. That's just weird, right? That doesn't feel right. Now let's switch back to 2 and 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 4. There we go. Give yourselves a hand. Give Derek a hand. That's just a fun little exercise. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page, because, you know, when one person's out of sync, it kind of stands out like a sore thumb. As you saw last week with the picture I shared, I grew up as a band nerd. And so not only did we have to learn how to play to a certain rhythm, we had to figure out how to get 100 people with wind instruments and drums mounted to their body to step on the same beats as well. So we had to figure out how to make sure 100 people's left feet were stepping on beats 1 and 3, and their right feet were stepping on beats 2 and 4. That's why you have these drum majors waving their arms around. That's actually to a certain beat, and we know that we have to stay in step with the drum major, with the conductor. And when you go to band competitions, just one person out of the 100 being out of step would cause the judges to discredit us and take away points. And I think the same thing can happen with local bodies of Christ, is that if one person is out of step, if one person is out of sync, then it can ruin the reputation and the vibe and the love that we're trying to express as a church family, because it just takes like one bad interaction in the lobby, one tone-deaf social media post to totally undo all of the love that we are trying to encounter as ambassadors of Christ, brothers and sisters in his family. And it never starts off with just being a jerk. It never just starts off with being rude. It starts off with small little things, getting in our comfort zone, talking to the same people week after week. And when those little things don't get recalibrated, we will find ourselves down the road totally misaligned and totally misrepresenting the love of Jesus that we want to be encountered here. And that's why we are spending the next few weeks diving into the book of Galatians. Because they, as you're about to see, were out of sync. They were out of step. They were out of rhythm with the good news of Jesus and the way that was supposed to be expressed in the faith gatherings there in this ancient Middle Eastern city of Galatia. And here's what I want us to do as we study some key themes in this book, is just to realize that unchecked steps off of God's path, they eventually lead us to unhealthy places. Now, we are a place of grace. We are a place of second and third chances. We think it's never too late for a new beginning. But we have to recognize that we as humans are going to gravitate toward our comfort zones. We as humans are going to gravitate toward the path of least resistance. And one of the things that we preach and talk about and try to encourage is how close-knit and how much of a family vibe that we want to offer this community. But how do we safeguard that closeness from becoming cliquey? How do we prevent familiarity from becoming a barrier of enter? Because when people walk through the doors, they may feel unnoticed, unseen, unwelcome. Now, I think we are a long way away from that here at this church. We're only about 2.5 years old, and one of the things we hear all the time from newcomers is how well connected and how warmly they're welcomed. But this is something that we always have to keep ourselves in check, because with the best of intentions, if we're not careful, we will wind up in the same boat as the Galatian church. So just to give a little bit of historical context and why this is relevant for us today, is the Galatian church was a church that was planted by Paul himself, one of the most prolific apostles who was responsible for a church planting movement all throughout the Middle East, Mediterranean area. And these churches that he would plant would be these places in their communities where people of different ethnicities would come together, people of different social classes would come together. And it was very much an experiment, because that didn't happen anywhere else in the cities and towns and villages where Christian churches were being planted. The only place where people from these different walks of life and backgrounds could come together as friends, could come together as a family, was inside of the local church. But there was something that was happening to several of these churches that Paul was planting, because usually what would happen is Paul would go to a new city, find a group of Jewish people at a synagogue, like their local temple, their local community center, and show these Jewish believers how Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled all the Old Testament prophecies. And he died on the cross and he rose again from the grave to forgive people of their sins, that he really was the promised one. And so there would always be this remnant of Jewish people who would place their faith in Jesus and receive this gospel that Paul was preaching. And then they would start a house church that would start reaching the Gentiles or the non-Jews of their community. And you can imagine people who had 600 ceremonial, civil, and religious regulations had a hard time translating which of those 600 laws the non-Jews would have to adhere to. And so Paul's message was the simple truth of the gospel. Place your faith in Jesus. It is by grace through faith that we are saved, not by works, so that no one can boast. Simple. Jesus. Believe and receive in his love for you. But a lot of these Jewish believers were trying to say, yes, that's good, but we also have to be what we call Torah observant. Those 600 laws are given to us in the first 5 books of Scripture. And so they were trying to say, yeah, you got to start eating the way that we eat. You got to start doing the same customs and have the same cleanliness standards that we have. And so no more bacon. I don't know about you. I love Jesus, but that would be hard. That would be hard. And so they ended up becoming this spiritual elite crowd and a spiritual inferior crowd. And they would start clicking up based on shared heritages, shared customs, shared beliefs. And Paul is coming at it really hard. And if your own study this week, if you read through the book of Galatians chapter 1, you will see that Paul is coming in hot. He's saying that anything on top of the message of Jesus being crucified for our sins and believing that he died on the cross and rose again, anything that we add to that message is heresy. It's Jesus plus nothing else. And if anybody's trying to add to that, they're not teaching you the real Jesus. So these divisions are starting to happen within this Galatian church. People are starting to camp up. People are starting to clique up. They're trying to figure out what is the right doctrine, what is the wrong doctrine. And Paul decides in chapter 2 to remind them of an exchange that he had in another church in Antioch, where Peter, a Jewish apostle, had a lapse in judgment and started treating his other Jewish brothers and sisters better than he would treat the non-Jewish brothers and sisters at this church in Antioch. And what you're going to see is Paul is using this story as a mirror to the toxicity that is happening there at the church in Galatia. So Paul, in chapter 2, verse 11 says, "But when Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, he ate with the Gentile believers who were not circumcised. But afterward, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of he was afraid of the criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. As a result, other Jewish believers followed Peter's hypocrisy, and even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. And when I saw that they were not following the truth of the gospel message, I said to Peter in front of all the others, 'Since you, a Jew by birth, have discarded the Jewish laws and are living like a Gentile, why are you now trying to make the Gentiles follow these Jewish traditions?'" So this is like a public conflict that Paul and Peter are having, because Peter, when some of the Jews are not around, is being all buddy and friendly with the non-Jews and is not trying to demand that they adhere to his heritage as a Jew. And Paul sees that when the other apostles come in, James, brother of Jesus, some of these guys who are Jewish ethnicity and more than likely still practicing a lot of the traditions of the Old Testament, he all of a sudden changes his tune. Doesn't he want to be associated with those people who worship differently, who have different customs and have different traditions and a different heritage. And Paul is basically telling Peter that partiality is like incompatible with the good news of Jesus. Preferential treatment does not work within the church. Paul is trying to remind Peter as a Jew that God's plan with partnering with his chosen people, the Jews, has always been, since the book of Genesis, to work with his chosen people to reach the whole world. I mean, I would say it like this: the purpose of God's chosen people has always been to reach all people. And when we start playing favorites, when we start clicking up, when we start trying to figure out who's in and who's out, totally based on preferences, we are out of step. We are clapping on beats 1 and 3 instead of beats 2 and 4. God's heart has always been to work with a remnant, faithful group of people to reach all people. And you and I cannot allow our preferences, our biases, our previous heritage and traditions to impact the way we welcome people into this family. So I want to give a couple of disclaimers really quick before we unpack this a little bit deeper. And the first thing I want you to understand is that priority doesn't have to mean partiality. I'll give an example. I'm going to treat my wife a lot sweeter than your wife. You're welcome. I'm going to hug and kiss my kids, not yours. We aren't talking about the priority relationships that are in your life. Those are good. We want you to be close. We don't want you to feel guilty for having people that you just have some sort of a spark with. I hope you find your future best friends in this church family. What we have to recognize is priority and partiality are not the same thing. Here's how I would define partiality. It could be the mistreatment or avoidance of people based on preferences. Now, I think it's easy for us to check the box about mistreatment. I've not heard one story about how any of you have mistreated anyone who has ever come through those doors, and I'm so thankful for that. But it's really, really easy to let this whole avoidance thing fly under the radar. My wife Erica works in foster care, and one of the forms of abuse that takes the greatest toll on kids who are in the system is not just the bad things that their parents have done to them. It's the absence of the good things that they have done to demonstrate their love. Neglect is a form of abuse. And in this moment, while Paul is addressing the divisions that are taking place inside this Galatian church, he story tells and recaps a moment how Peter, one of their spiritual giants, messed this up too. So if the dudes who walked with Jesus struggled with playing favorites, then I think we have to be on guard as well. It is good to have priority relationships in your life. Even Jesus had the 12 who he spent a crazy amount of time with compared to the masses and the multitudes and the people that he was healing. He had a relationship with the 12. He had some great exchanges with people who he served with miracles and healings, but he had a relationship with the 12. And even with inside the 12, there was an inner three, Peter, James, and John, who got to see special things. And so I don't want you to feel like you're in trouble today because you're sitting next to your best friend, right? Priority relationships are a good thing and a beautiful thing. And I hope that this church is the brokerage for some of your closest relationships in life. We just have to fight the slow fade from when closeness accidentally becomes cliquey. We all have the capacity for it, and we all need to be on guard against it. And that's what the book of James is all about, is how to have a family of God that is blended from people of all different walks of life. That they would come through the doors, they would feel seen, they would feel noticed, and they would feel that this is somewhere where they could call home. And I'm just thinking it's important that every once in a while as a church, we are just willing to examine ourselves and see if we need some realignment, to see if we need to be back in rhythm, back in step with the message of Jesus. Because partiality is incompatible with this message. Matter of fact, if you look in the epistle written by Jesus' own brother, James, he says this, for example, suppose someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes. If you give special attention and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you can stand over there or else sit on the floor, well, doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? Discrimination is a harsh word and something that I don't think any of us would want to be placed on us, right? But again, unchecked steps off of God's path will put us in unhealthy places. No one wakes up and decides that they are going to start being cliquey and exclusive and playing favorites. It's a slow fade. But nonetheless, right here we see in the New Testament that partiality is a form of discrimination. So we're going to tackle real quick one of the most highly debated, sensitive social subjects in America today. Is turkey bacon real bacon? Be careful, we're talking about welcoming people with differences of opinions. Listen, I don't even remember the last time turkey bacon has been in my house. But if you were coming to visit and you're not a fan of real bacon, we would first try to share the good news of Jesus with you. But then we would order some turkey bacon for you and just smile through it, right? We can't let our differences lead to discrimination. I'll even let you come hang out with me if you like vegan bacon, which I don't even know what that is. It's okay to have differences. It's okay that you were raised a certain way. It's okay that you maybe even have different preferences about the way this place should look and sound, which songs we should sing, what type of clothes you wish we would wear. It's okay to have opinions. But so often, we start building our cultures and our treatment of others and our belief systems around opinions. And those opinions, if we're not careful, can become weaponized. And if we're not careful, we will start viewing people with different opinions as our opposition. And that can't be the case here. And that's what Paul is trying to address and trying to confront throughout the entire epistle to the Galatians. And it's all wrapped around majoring in the majors and minoring in the minors. And the thing that he is trying to rally people around in the first 2 chapters is the truth of God's message, his love for all people. And that if we claim to be his people, then we better not be guilty of creating unnecessary barriers of entry for those who are far from God. And I just think that it's something we always got to be vigilant against. Something we've always got to wrestle with. Is this thing that's causing me angst, or this thing that person does that is rubbing me the wrong way? Am I feeling the need to defend myself based off of preferences or biblical principles? It's a great wrestling match to always have within our hearts and our minds, because if we don't keep that in check, we will find ourselves like Peter, being out of step with the message of Jesus, because we're camping up with people who think like we do. That's why I think we always have to get back to what Jesus said when he was asked about the greatest commandment. Out of all of the 600 commands that were given to the Jewish people in the Torah, Jesus offered up the idea of loving God with all of our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength, right? But then also loving our neighbor as ourselves. And when Jesus offered that up, the religious elite wanted to try to trip him up, as they always were. They never asked Jesus questions because they wanted to know his response. You ever have somebody in your life that asks you questions because they're trying to figure out how they can refute whatever you say instead of listening to it? That was Jesus with all of the religious people. And so their refutation of Jesus' assertion of the 2 greatest commandments, love God and love people, was, well, Jesus, that sounds great, but who is my neighbor anyway? If I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus, in Luke chapter 10, responds to this smart aleck question, who is my neighbor? He says, a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. He was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. This is the story of the Good Samaritan. And you've probably heard this preached before, that people who were upright Jewish citizens in this story walked by the person who had been beaten up. But a Samaritan comes along who the Jewish people would have considered second-class citizens, and nurses this guy and pays for his bills at a local inn for him to rest and recover. The villain became the hero to this group of Jewish leaders. And Jesus says, now which of these would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? He said, the one who showed him mercy. They couldn't even bring themselves to say the Samaritan because they were so fixated on labels and his different worldview and his different ethnicity and his different culture and customs and traditions. The hero of your story, Jesus, is the Samaritan? That guy? And Jesus says, yeah, now go and do the same. About a year ago, some of our close friends in our cul-de-sac decided it was time to sell their house. Their kids were our kids' ages, and they hung out all the time. They were really, really close. And so we, in the cul-de-sac, were all really nervous about who our new neighbors would be. And the whole day that they were having the open houses for several Saturdays in a row to start figuring out who the neighborly candidates would be, we're all like spying, looking in the blinds, trying to figure out if they would be good neighbors or not. When we finally found out who put an offer, you better believe we all found them on Facebook. Not once, though, did I ever ask, what type of neighbors are we to these new people? I think Jesus is telling us that being a good neighbor is greater than looking for good neighbors. If we are focused on being good neighbors here at this church, we'll find good neighbors. But if we're looking for something wrong, if we're looking for things that make us uncomfortable with people, if we're looking for things to use as excuses to keep people at a certain distance, then we are out of step with the good news of Jesus. And I don't want someone to have to write a letter to us 10 years from now like Paul had to write to the Galatian church about the slow fade that happens when we let divisions creep in. When we build systems based on our preferences instead of the principles that are given to us in the Word of God. So instead of us creating all these checks, boxes that need to be checked for who is in and who is out, who belongs here, who is worthy of my attention, let's ask ourselves, am I a good neighbor? How am I doing with just living out the good news of Jesus? I know that seems super elementary, and we've got plenty of environments for you to go really deep. All of our Bible studies are launching. But before we ask for more theology and greater depth, let's just ask ourselves, how are we doing with being a good neighbor, loving God and loving people? Let's start there. And I just think if we focus on being neighborly, if we focus on making it as easy as possible for people to encounter and discover the love of Jesus in us, in our conversations, then I think this is going to be something irresistible to this community. Not because we're better than any other church, not because we have certain people on the worship team, not because of the way we do kids ministry. All of those are great things. But our culture has to be loving God, loving people, being a good neighbor. Man, if we can get that right, I think the message of the gospel will be unstoppable in this community.